welcome to this series of lectures on history, and today we are talking about modern European history in the context of the 19th century, and the specific topic of our discussion today is nationalism and nation states in Europe. And in the next half an hour or so, we would be talking about the theoretical part of it. This is a vast topic as the title itself suggests, because nation state and its ideological counterpart of nationalism is to be tackled in historical perspective that would require us to wade through a variety of ways and means by which nationalism arose across the 19th century European history, and nation states at different points of time in this century came up in different parts of Europe. So it's a tremendously vast topic, all right, and we in the next half an hour are only restricting our discussion to the theoretical formulation. Some of these scholars have postulated theories related to nationalism and nation states, and that is what we would be talking about. Now, being a student of history, one should be little bit wary about such definitions, because the philosophy of history is ideographic. It's not nomothetic the way anthropology is, the way sociology is, the way several other social sciences deliberately want themselves to be arriving at some kind of a theory, some kind of a definition for each of the things which constitute their subject matter. Now, in history, we don't begin with such a definitional aspect of institutions or ideology. We just see through examples the way it actually happened, and there could be a variety of instances that can prick quite a few popular theories, however sophisticated they might sound, but there would always be some exceptions. There would be always some new dimensions to quite a few theoretical formulations. So that's the spirit with which historians work, and therefore we would be rather focusing on the developmental part of nation and nationalism. But to begin with, let's look at some of the theories that go around related to nationalism and nation states. And please remember, our discussion is restricted to Europe, particularly the last quarter of 18th century and the entire 19th century Europe. Now, as you can see on your slide, if you have a big picture of 19th century European history, you come across three big ideologies that permeate the history of 19th century Europe. They are liberalism, nationalism, and socialism. So, if you are looking at the history of Europe, basically you have to look at how liberalism, nationalism, and socialism unfolded at different points of time in different regions of Europe across 19th century, what constituted the pith and substance of these formulations, these ideologies, and the way they played out in association with each other during 19th century. Who are the you can say the social constituencies who are carrying forward the ideology of liberalism, nationalism, socialism, and so forth. And there are several you can see there are several coming together of these ideologies, several instances where these ideologies come together. There are several instances where these ideologies sharpen against each other, get sharpened against each other. The social constituency, that is maybe that the bourgeoisie is pushing for a particular ideology, and the working class, which by around the middle of 19th century comes up in a big way in an organized fashion with the incremental industrial revolution happening across the continent, particularly by the middle of the 19th century. Western Europe had fairly industrialized. England, France, and Germany, the big three of European continent. So all these complexities certainly added lot of variety, lot of you can say distinct ways in which these three ideologies unfolded. And since we are talking about nationalism, so we would be narrowing our discussion to whatever is happening around this term nationalism or emergence of the nation states. One thing that is also clear about these three ideologies or the perennial themes of 19th century European history is that they are all born of Enlightenment period. And when we say they are all born of Enlightenment period, what we mean here is that the ideas related to what a liberal society has to be or should be, the idea what a nation state should be, what nationalism should be, and what socialist you can say impulses should be, like the element of equality, the element of doing away with rich, poor, and so forth. All these things are spoken of, are written about by different Enlightenment scholars almost a century before when they actually played out on the real historical plane. For example, when we say coming of the nation state, modern nation state, with the element of nationalism pushing it. Now, of course, it was first done with reference to the French Revolution 1789, but Enlightenment scholars had already been writing about citizenship. They had already been writing about as to what fraternity and brotherhood or equality should be, and that is what should be the ideal type of a nation state and so forth. However, it actually played out on the historical plane later, that is around the 19th century. So that is something that we have to keep in mind, that they are all modern concepts which had been written about by the Enlightenment scholars, say till around the middle of the 18th century itself. However, it is the actual playing out of these ideology in the 19th century that we are concerned with. Since we just discussed that be it liberalism, be it nationalism, be it socialism, they are all associated with modernization, the process of modernization which was triggered not only by Enlightenment writers, but also by industrial revolution that was simultaneously going on, and several other political movements like the French Revolution itself, the scientific revolution that had preceded this particular century, say in 17th century. So all these things had led to a fair degree of dynamism to European history, and therefore these ideologies also all across its existence in the 19th century, and of course subsequently also, but since our discussion is essentially around 19th century, so these concepts, these institutions also underwent change, and you will find that the French Republic that comes up as a consequence of the French Revolution in 1789 will be different from the German state that comes up towards the middle of the 19th century as a result of unification process triggered by Bismarck and so forth. Similarly, the same holds true for Italian unification. So the Republic of Italy that comes into being is also bearing the imprint of the time it was created as a state. So it will have a different tinge of ideology of nationalism as compared to what it was in the case of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution happened with a different set of aspirations and ideology, although they were all written by Enlightenment scholars, but the sheer timeline that you get to see when a particular nation state got created across 19th century Europe is also important, and that is why we find that these concepts also being intricately related to modernization changed over a period of time. So across the 19th century also we have a different varieties of nationalism and nation states, and that is something that we will see. Now Definitionally speaking, since I told you about the fact that several sociologists, some the iconic ones like Max Weber and so forth, have extensively written about nationalism and nation states, and it has been a perennial debate amongst the historians and sociologists whether to regard nation in the form of a concept as political or cultural. Similarly, should we regard nationalism as or understand nationalism as or with reference to some objective set of parameters, or is it that nationalism is a subjectively created category? And if that is so, then of course we will have a polarity of opinions around this particular concept and this particular institution, concept in the form of nationalism and nation state in the form of an institution. So there is a variety here, there is a range of arguments here. Now, as you can see on your slide, we begin with Max Weber, the iconic sociologist who wrote around the last decade of the 19th century and first couple of decades of 20th century as well. And he says, or he rather regards nation as a prestige community, and he sees nation drawing from both, that is material interest of the state as well as a sense of irreplaceable cultural values. So you can very well see here that there is fair degree of the element of subjectivity associated with nationalism as per Weber's understanding, but there also are some objective parameters that can be understood with reference to the institution of the state. And subsequently we will see as to what as to how he defines state or nationalism and so forth. It would be better to first look at his definition and then come back to this. So if you do that, as you can see on your slide, Weber tends to define nationalism as a community of, or nation as a community of sentiment which would normally produce a state of its own. So what he is trying to say here is that it's not essential for a nation to have an institution like state necessarily, or you can say that state is not an absolute requirement. State as an institution is not an absolute requirement for existence of nation or nationalism as sentiment, as subjective set of ideas. But whenever the idea of nation precipitates in history, whenever it is taken forward in any formidable sense of the term, then it tends to produce, normally, historically, it is almost true that all national sensibilities and sentiments eventually desires to have a state of its own. Now, state here is objective. State here is understood with reference to very defined tangible parameters. You need to have bureaucracy, you need to have taxation system, you need to have territory, you need to have police system, you need to have army, you need to have espionage and so forth. So these are the different limbs of the state about which Weber has extensively written. He has also written about power and authority, which are essential constituents of the state. We shall talk about that, but what is important here in terms of Weber's definition is that it draws from both, that is subjective as well as objective parameters. And here the objective criteria, as I said, the existence of the state with reference to language or decent group associated with blood and so forth, these are some of the things that Weber discards, and he says that it is the subjective basis through which nation, or the concept of nation should rather be understood, and he adds the objective parameter of state as some kind of an addendum, historical addendum, that normally when something like that precipitates, it tends to have a state of its own. So, coming back to what he is saying, Weber is saying nation as a prestige community. So, when we say prestige community, that means that it gives you a sense of pride, it imbues you with a sense of history and so forth. So, community desires to have such kind of an ideology, and in creating in manufacturing this kind of an ideology, they resort to both material interests of the state as well as the cultural values. So, you can see that Weber is trying to somewhat combine the two, although he gives precedence to the subjective aspect of the definition of nation as compared to the objective ones exemplified by the institution and you can say apparatus of the state itself. Next, we have Zernato, and Zernato is giving us etymological approach to look at this particular issue of nation and nationalism and nation state. And he, since it is an etymological approach, therefore he looks at the root of this word nation, and he locates this root in the Latin word natio, and natio in Latin would mean something that is associated with birth, and therefore this word, this term nation is derived from this root which is associated with birth, and therefore we should be aware of this whenever we analyze the concept of nation and nationalism. And also he highlights that there is no fixity of meaning in this word. If you look at the journey of this word across time, across regions, Zernato gives us enough examples that this word has been used in different contexts and different sense altogether. We shall see in next slide as to what are the range of meanings of this word in European context, and some of them are startlingly different from what we mean today by this term nationalism or nation. And therefore, the point that he is trying to make here is that it is only after the French Revolution, it is only at the behest of the revolutionaries that a particular meaning which by and large is the current meaning of nationalism and nationhood that was imparted to it. Otherwise, in the times prior to the French Revolution, this word had very little to do with the kinds of things with which we associate it today. So, Zernato gives us several examples, and he says that this term has been over time been variously associated with a range of meanings, and just look at the list: birds, professions. So, there was a point of time in particular part of Europe where natio meant birds, or when it connoted something related to professions, something related to bodies of students, something associated with council representatives, something related to members of aristocratic and religious estates. Now, just see the variety of the connotations of this particular word prior to the French Revolution, and he says that it is the iconic French Revolution with which this term nation got associated with peoples or states or masses. So, it is at the hands of the revolutionaries or the republicans, the Jacobins that we find, or sans-culottes, that we find that these elements like peoples or state machinery or masses, they got associated with this word nation in a big way, and it started connoting something which is close to, say, common heritage with which a range of people, a variety of people are associated and so forth. So, there are different types of nationalism, and we shall be talking about that as well. Similarly, if you look at the writings of Hobbsbomb, the iconic Marxist historian, he also tends to regard nation as a modern concept, because since our discussion is related to only European history and 19th century European history, so we are not going into several other cultural ways and historical sense in which we can locate such concept in history prior to 19th century. For example, in India itself, there are historians who would rather talk about the concept of Chakravarti or Pan-Indianism and India having an identity, or in people of this subcontinent having an identity of its own in internal sense, as well as in terms of what people from outside saw this subcontinent as, and so forth. So, such debates are very much there, but our discussion is about European context of 19th century, and in this Hobbsbomb restricts the understanding of nation as a modern concept, and all pre-modern association of different activities or traits or sensibilities is discarded by him, and he says that it has to be understood as a modernizing phenomena, and that should be the point of departure. Similarly, there is this vexed issue of the nation states being a legal and territorial entity, while its core being intensely subjective, something psychological with which it is identified. And when it is psychological identification, subjective issue, that can at times defy reason, that goes beyond reason. So, if it is psychological, if it is subjective, you cannot subject it to reason all the time. And please remember, French revolutionaries, particularly in the first 2-3 years of the revolution till around the reign of terror, 1793 up to around 1793-94, there was lot of accentuation of the rational aspect of whatever they were doing. They had done away with previous practices. They had done away with all customary things with which French polity was identified and defined. They had replaced the calendar. They had created new goddess of reason. They had renamed months of the year on the basis of reason, on the basis of season, agrarian concepts and so forth. And that the point was that they were subjecting everything to reason, and reason was the even that instrument guillotine is something that was devised with the reason that it should very quickly bring about death of the convict, and it should be brought about with minimum pain, and with so much of swiftness with respect to time. So, it was all reason that was brought into play to devise things, to understand past and so forth. And there was a mistake here that they were doing. I mean, they had perhaps underestimated the power of emotion, the power of subjectivities, the power of psychological thought processes that have shaped several generations. And that is something that the revolutionaries realized very soon, because by 1815, it is the conservatives who had come back to power by the Congress of Vienna around 1814-1815 after the fall of Napoleon. So, that is something which we should always understand with a pinch of salt. And then there is ethno-nationalism, which can work as centrifugal force, because if it is about ethnic identity and the idea of nationalism is weaved around it, will it always result only into creation of a nation state? Or once the nation state is created, the institutional nation state is created, will it stop there? No, it doesn't, because if it is ethno-nationalism, then there would be several other ethnic groups which over a period of time would grow restive and start demanding separation from the existing paraphernalia of the state of which it is a part, and that is something that we get to see on several occasions in 19th century history. One state is getting created, and then from within that there is subnational identities and ethnic clamor to create another state of its own, and that is very well known. So, overall, after having run through this range of arguments, what we find is that modern nation state should be regarded as one of the most significant and powerful of all human institutions. For example, even institution of family, even several other institutions had to come to terms with this creation of nation state as an institution. It organizes the political lives of a given people in a particular land area over which it has sovereign jurisdiction. This is the defining characteristic feature of nation state, sovereignty. That's the ultimate decision maker. Similarly, it creates laws to regulate behavior, human behavior, social behavior, and so forth, and therefore there are punitive measures, there are several other measures, facilitating measures. It caters to human needs through bureaucracies and government agencies. So these are the institutions that Weber has extensively written about, how actually nation state functions. So it functions through bureaucracies and government agencies, and he has defined it in a very sophisticated way as to what are the roles and the ideal types of these institutions. Some of these states offer personal liberties to its citizens, others could be repressive, even totalitarian. So there is a variety. So there could be, as I just said, that the Bismarckian state, German state that came into being was different from the kind of republican liberal state that was formed as a consequence of the French Revolution. The same holds true for the Italian state and several other states in the last quarter of 19th century. Weber says that states function because they can wield power, and power is defined in two terms: physical force, that is military and police, which is coercive, and if they don't comply, if the people don't comply, then the state comes out with its physical force and establishes order. Else, he also talks of latent force, and he says that it is more formidable, it is more advisable for the state to exercise latent force, and that is just a threat of physical force. You don't have to actually exercise it. Just the looming possibility of physical force gets people to act in a particular desired way, and that is how state functions. Similarly, he has spoken about authority, which is an essential component of state. He talks about power that is presumed as legitimate by its subject, and that is what he understands by authority. Otherwise, all powers, different kinds of powers are there, but when we talk of state authority, it is a power which is regarded as legitimate by its citizens through, say, elections or other customary things or other defined ways in which they choose to create a particular state. Similarly, all these modern way of creating this kind of a state that 19th century Europe saw are summed up as rational legal authority. And that is the defining feature of 19th century European states that was spoken about by the Enlightenment scholars and so forth. And this is the pith and substance of the authority that Weber writes about. So in this interaction, in this lecture, we have spoken about the theoretical part of the state, how historians and sociologists have written about this concept of nationalism and the institution of nation states and its essential requirements and so forth. So that is it for you. Thank you.